Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome both to our in-person guests and to our online audiences. My name is Emmanuel Fiano, and I am the co-director of the Fordham Center for Jewish Studies, along with Professor Magda Tater. Together with my colleague, Karina Hogan from the Theology Department, who co-organized this event, we are very glad to introduce to you tonight this talk by Professor Chaya Halberstam. Professor Halberstam is a professor of Hebrew Bible and Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario. Her research focuses on the legal cultures of Israelite and Jewish antiquity, with an emphasis on early rabbinic literature. Her work explores the role of legal discourse in shaping cultural attitudes and practices, and the limits of this discourse. Her first book, Law and Truth in Biblical and Rabbinic Literature, came out in 2010 and received the Salo Baron Prize for Best First Book in Jewish Studies. Her most recent book, Trial Stories in Jewish Antiquity, Counternarratives of Justice, came out in 2024 with Oxford University Press. She will be speaking tonight about trial stories in ancient Judaism, and we're really very grateful to her for joining us tonight. So, love your presentation.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Emmanuel and Karina and everyone else at Fordham Jewish Studies for having me here. I really, really appreciate this chance to get to speak about my new book, which is really exciting that it finally came out. So that is the topic of my talk tonight, which is about trial stories in ancient Judaism. So surprisingly, there was not already a book on trial stories in ancient Judaism. Especially it's surprising considering that probably one of the most famous trial stories in the entire world and possibly all of human history is a trial story from ancient Judaism, and that's the trial of Jesus, which I do actually treat in the book, though I'm not going to be talking about it here. Sorry, I have to stop wandering away because of the Zoom people. So there was not actually already a book on the genre of trial stories in Jewish antiquity. It is a topic that's been written about in various other areas of antiquity, like the Greek novella. But I want to try and first explain why I think trial stories are important and not just kind of entertaining, fun reads. So one of the things I try to do by calling the subtitle is Counternarratives of Justice, is to try to say that trial stories play a really important role in our culture, or stories in general play a very important role in our culture, and trial stories do as well. So just to kind of explain a little bit about what a counter-narrative is that generally in culture, we have dominant narratives. And these dominant narratives are usually things that we don't ever think about, that they're underground, they're not stories we tell all that often because they're just so taken for granted. Right now, at this moment in history, may be one of these times when some of our cultural narratives are starting to show up as visible, like the whole, leader of the free world idea, that, the place of the US in the world, for example, is one of those things we don't think about that much until it, something goes awry, and then suddenly it's like, wait, is that story true or not true? So that's kind of what a counter narrative is. And these can be just like short stories as literature. It can be real stories, true stories that we tell. And what counter narratives do, they're not going to replace the dominant narrative because then it just becomes the dominant narrative. So what counter narratives do are going to kind of critique the dominant narrative, but have multiple different angles from which they do it so that the eventual goal is for us to admit that there isn't one big story that can tell, the truth of our culture. One just quick example of this is the Me Too movement, which I think is a perfect example of a cultural narrative, a dominant narrative, and counter narratives. We had a narrative that nobody really thought about, that from the 60s and onwards, women got equal rights and were basically equal in the workplace with men, and that was done and we did well. The Me Too movement were stories, right? Everyone told their story, and each story in a different way. They weren't all exactly the same story. Kind of showed that that narrative may not really be the full truth and the full story. And together, all of those stories added up to us really having to reckon with, that cultural narrative and whether things needed to change. So trial stories in particular tend to be about justice. And trial stories are really, really popular, always have been, probably always will be. The motif of the trial story, and here I am quoting Sandra Schwartz, who wrote a book on trial stories in the ancient Greek novella. She writes, the motif of the trial is ubiquitous in world literature. So we have a lot of trial stories today, some of them true, some of them dramatized, like Law and Order, which I used to watch obsessively, were all trial stories. The OJ trial, I know I'm dating myself with that, but that was also a very long trial story. We love trial stories. A lot of movies that we watch are big trials. So it's something that continues to be very popular and always was, or at least from antiquity on, trial stories were very frequently found. And here's some analysis, and this is Miura Kensky. These two books were actually very influential in my thinking about this book. So Sandra Schwartz wrote about the trial story in the ancient Greek novella, and Miura Kensky wrote about the divine trial stories in Jewish antiquity. So it was called God's courtroom, right? Where God appears as the judge. So between those two, I was like, so what about just regular, like, human trial stories in Jewish antiquity? And that was kind of a gap that I thought I could fill. But Miura Kensky says very correctly, placing the legal system front and center before the reader invites the reader to make judgments on the process itself, judging whether or not it is capable of reaching a just verdict. So the idea is that when we have a trial story, we're not just, watching passively, but we as the viewers or the readers are making judgments just like the judge is making judgments, and we're judging whether the process is good and just or not. So a lot of the trial stories that I just mentioned, like Law and Order or things like that, or the movies like Aaron Brockovich, are stories where we usually judge that, it's a happy ending. So the process seems to be working really well, right? There's something that's very unjust. There's this long, drawn out court battle, and eventually the law steps in and makes things right. So that would be one example. But those kinds of stories, I'll get to this in a second, those kind of stories tend to do what these images do that I'll talk about in a minute, which is to confirm the dominant narrative that we have about justice. This happy ending narrative where the courts will make everything right and the law will stop bad people from doing bad things. And that's why we have the justice system. Aside from stories, or kind of to back up stories, we have images, and these are also from antiquity, images that try to show that justice is an objective, stable thing that will always sort of bring us back to the right path and justice. So one of these images is lesser known, one is more well known. The top one is the plumb line, and that's a measuring instrument to make sure that things are exactly vertical. And so the idea was that the plumb line was used as an image of justice, because just like you can have this, you need a straight line, to build a building or a wall. That straight line is kind of justice. So if you're building on a foundation that doesn't have that, then it's going to fall down. And similarly, the scales are also an image from antiquity, from ancient Egypt. So it seems to be their origin. And this is also just a measuring instrument, right? So that we can always judge whether it's correct or not. And that justice should be clear to us, as much as we can see whether scales are balanced or out of balance. So in my little thing here, I have, this tends to be equated with something like truth or law. Like these are the objective kind of measures that we can hold on to of justice. I'm not going to go into this story now, but I just wanted to put it up there as an exemplar of a biblical story in the Hebrew Bible of a kind of perfect justice. So this is, again, a story that would underscore the dominant narrative that the king is great and wise and just and can cut through all of the ambiguity and unknown mysteries and make everything right and true and just again. So that's one example there. And but I'm going to move away from the Hebrew Bible because my work really focuses on the trial stories of Jewish antiquity, starting from pretty much the Second Temple period and the Rabbinic period. So kind of after the bulk of the Hebrew Bible is finished. And part of why I wanted to do that is that everything really changes pretty radically, I would say, between the kind of ancient Near Eastern context of some of the earlier works of the Hebrew Bible and the Greco-Roman context. The Persian period is kind of in the middle there, and people aren't quite sure which side to put it with. But the thing that changes is that the Greeks and the Romans export this cultural idea of the rule of law. So before that, if you think about Solomon, Solomon is a wise judge. Like, he figures out this ingenious way to get justice. And that's kind of the way judges were supposed to operate in most ancient Near Eastern ways of thinking about this. But Greece and Rome export this idea, or bring in this idea with them, that judges aren't supposed to just use their own wisdom to figure out what's just, but that there are laws that are either written or unwritten, but there are pre-existing laws before that judge ever walked into the room, and that adherence to these laws are what creates justice. And the great thing about the rule of law, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, is that even rulers are going to be kept in check by the rule of law. So I'll just read, this is a Roman legal historian who writes this about Rome. The imperial vision of the law was founded on the idea that there existed a disembodied world of rules that transcended even the emperor himself, and that these rules could be accessed by the skillful use of authoritative legal text in the context of courtroom encounters structured by proper procedure. So scholars of Roman legal history have really been, especially lately, emphasizing this because it's seen as one of the ways that empires like Greece and Rome were able to be successful, is that they're not just imposing lots of stuff on an unwilling population, but they're actually giving them what in their minds was civilization, right? Before, you were just doing whatever you wanted, and now we're giving you this incredible system that will show a real civilized society and culture. And it does seem very clear that provincials who lived under this tended to laugh it up and really use it and like it and adopt it for themselves, including Jews. So just to underscore what the rule of law does is that you're not using your own wisdom, but that a judge is kind of supposed to be almost like this blank slate, like a conduit for something higher than them, impartial, objective, and some legal scholars call that the view from nowhere, right? They're not supposed to put their own humanness and persona into whatever the verdict is. It's supposed to just channel something higher. So as I was saying before, it does seem like Jews who were Roman provincials by at least the late Second Temple period and were Greek under Greek rule for the whole Second Temple period, pretty much, that they really adopted this rule of law. And it's one of the reasons why it seems, especially now, scholarship seems to be going in the direction of the real, outpouring of legal writing in the rabbinic period, especially, is an outcome of Rome really stressing the rule of law and having elaborated legal systems that Jews up until then, we had laws, but didn't have like a really robust system where law covered pretty much every corner of social life. So I just wanted to give an example, and this is a kind of idealized story. It's not quite a story, but it's sort of a narrative. You can see it in story form of how judges were supposed to act in rabbinic imagination. So this is from Mishnah Sanhedrin, and this is just one excerpt of it. It goes on really, really long. The Sanhedrin was like half of a round threshing floor so that they would be able to see each other. And this image is just something I found. I guess someone tried to reconstruct what it would have looked like so that they would be able to see each other. And two scribes for the judges stand before them, one from the right and one from the left. And they write the words of those for acquittal and the words of those for conviction. Rabbi Yehuda says there were three. One writes the words of those for acquittal, one writes the words of those for conviction, and one writes the words of the third writes the words of those for acquittal and those for conviction. So why this duplication, right? This is all to verify that everything is accurate, right? So this is a real example of where judges are really supposed to be transparent, open, following, proper procedure. And a story like this, if this is what judges are doing, is really comforting that what's going on behind closed doors is a real proper legal procedure. But what I'm going to argue is that there's a whole bunch of ancient Jewish trial story counter narratives, and they are actually poking holes in this larger idea of law working out perfectly and everything being transparent and great and it all working smoothly. There are lots of reasons why, and we can get into that in the Q&A period, but I think that this is also just, part of this larger pattern of every time there's a cultural narrative, it doesn't always, there are limitations to that, and it doesn't capture the truth of everything. So you're always going to have stories that push against it and that try to show the limitations or the ways in which it doesn't work. So all of the stories that I look at in the book are counter narratives, are trying to kind of poke holes in this grand vision that we like to tell ourselves, and that's very comforting, that the rule of law keeps everyone in check and promotes justice everywhere. So I'm just going to give a few examples. I can't go through everything, but I wanted to give a few examples of the kinds of stories that I'm looking at and the kinds of things that they tend to say about law through their trial stories. I'm going to use examples both from Second Temple literature and from rabbinic literature. So one of the things that some of these narratives say is that the rule of law simply leads to injustice, at least sometimes. And I read the story of Daniel in the lion's den really as almost an overt critique of the rule of law. To just, kind of repeat the story we all kind of think we know these stories, but it always helps to get a refresher. Daniel is a loyal servant of the king, Darius the Mede, and Darius loves him, and he's a great servant, and he's really pious as well. But the officials are all jealous of him, so they help the king write a law that would catch Daniel doing something illegal. And that law is that no one in the kingdom is allowed to petition anyone other than the king. So if you had a complaint, it had to go straight to the king and not to anyone else. And that stroked the king's ego. So he said, yeah, sure, let's do that. And they do it. Then Daniel goes to pray to his God, as he always does. And that prayer is seen as petitioning someone else besides the king. So the officials catch him doing this. They haul him before the king and they talk to the king about it. So this is my little quotation here. The officials went and talked to the king about the law. Your Majesty, didn't you sign a law that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or human besides you, Your Majesty, would be thrown into a pit of lions? The king replied, the decision is absolutely firm in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be annulled. And I'm going to just pause here for 1 second, because this little phrase, the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be annulled, like, or ever changed, even the king can't change it, is found both here and in the book of Esther for people celebrating Purim. That is coming up very soon, so it's timely. And scholars have never known what to make of this, because there's nothing about this that's historically true. Kings could always do whatever they wanted. They did not have to, like, oh no, we have to make another law because they can't change that law. But I really read this as the writers of this story playing with this idea of the rule of law, like even keeps, even the emperor is held in check by the rule of law. So I think they're kind of playing with that idea, which is a relatively new idea for these communities. So they have that, and then so they say to the king, one of the Judean exiles, Daniel, has ignored you, Your Majesty, as well as the law he signed. He petitions his God 3 times a day. When the king heard this report, he was very upset. So the king is upset, but he feels like he has to throw Daniel in the lion's pit, even though he doesn't want to, and even though he's with the king, because of the law. So I think this is a very obvious example of how they're kind of saying, maybe the rule of law doesn't always work because people can manipulate the law, or the law isn't always just in every case. A lot of people read this story as one that's about divine intervention. So in the end, as we know, Daniel gets thrown in the pit of lions, and God has to come and shut the mouth of the lions, so that he just stands there and they're all just standing around, and then he can come out, and so God miraculously saves him. And so some read this story as being about, when society fails you, God can swoop in and miraculously save you if you're pious and you serve God. But I think there's another message in here, which is that the fact that the king already knew this was unjust, and he's just like, well, I don't know, there's nothing I can do. Like, none of this had to happen, and God did not need to show up miraculously if the king had just been able to do the right thing that he absolutely knew was the right thing. And I think that that's a real part of the critique as well. Not that we have to rely on God, but we didn't have to rely on God. And God was kind of forced to do this because people couldn't act justly. So that's one example, and I've got a whole chapter about Daniel if you want to read more about that. We find similar stories in rabbinic literature, particularly in the Babylonian Talmud, which has a lot of stories of critique like this. The Babylonian Talmud also has a lot of stories of law going well, so it definitely doesn't always just critique it, but there are stories of critique. This is one Lynn Kay has written about stories of women coming to court in rabbinic literature, and there are a few of these like this, kind of a motif. So here's one example. A certain widow came before Rabba bar Rav Huna to collect payment for her marriage contract from her late husband's heirs. So when men died, women had no property, and so somehow had to be supported because the property would go to their male heirs. He said to her, "What can I do for you, as Rav does not collect payment for marriage contract for a widow, and my father, my master, Rav Huna, does not collect payment of a marriage contract for a widow." Like, this is the practice, this is the precedent, right? I can't do anything about it. She said to him, "If I cannot collect payment of the marriage contract, then provide sustenance for me from the husband's property to support me until I remarry." He said to her, "You also don't have the right to sustenance, as Rabbi Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, one who demands payment of her marriage contract in court has no right then to demand payment for sustenance." So she messed it up by asking for that one first, and now since he couldn't do that, and now she asked for this, and he can't do that either. She cursed him, "May you fall from power. You ruled against me twice over." So this is all like she's just left having to curse him because there's nothing that can be done if we're going to follow these laws. And again, I do see this, as a critique of kind of blindly following what the law says instead of, like leaving this woman with like literally no way to feed herself. There are other stories that show that the rule of law can sometimes lead to greater harm in society than the original issue. So one of these, and I look at trial stories in Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities. So Josephus writes a whole history of the Jews from the creation of the world until when he lived, which is the war against Rome and the destruction of the Second Temple. And he has a lot of stories of trials in there. And interestingly, almost none of his trials end up in a verdict. Like something happens and the trial just kind of disappears. And this is one of those examples. And this is a really, really great story of Herod, who is starting to rise to power as a young upstart. And he's going to be seen as this mad and horrible king who just runs roughshod over everybody's rights and does whatever he wants. So the rise of Herod is foreboding and ominous and not a good thing. So here's a moment when, before he's really made it to power, Herod gets hauled into a trial because he's just kind of killed a bunch of bandits or a bunch of people without taking them to court, without any kind of due process. He just kind of dispatched with these people. So they haul Herod in saying, like, you just murdered a bunch of people. But they don't really seem to hold him to account. So what happens in the story is, and this is somewhat of a summary, everyone, whosoever he be, that comes to be tried by this assembly presents himself in a submissive manner, and like one that is in fear of himself, and that endeavors to move us to compassion, with his hair disheveled and in a black and mourning garment. But this admirable man, Herod, who is accused of murder and called to answer so heavy an accusation, stands here clothed in purple, and with the hair of his head finely trimmed, and with his armed men all about him, that if we shall condemn him by our law, he may slay us, and by overbearing justice may himself escape death. So you can get the story here of what happened, right? He showed up like with armed men, being like, okay, you know what'll happen if you rule against me. So this is part of a critique by one of the people standing up there who says you shouldn't have let this happen. But in the story that Josephus tells, they do let this happen. They kind of either dissolve the trial or like let Herod sneak away because, and I think that it's not necessarily clear in Josephus that this was the wrong thing to do. Because either way, like we either let him rise to power and then he's harmful to all of us, or we rule against him and he maybe kills all of us right now. Like it's, not an easy situation to decide what the right thing to do is. And over and over in Josephus's trials, you see judges opting to either just stop the trial or to negotiate and to come to some kind of agreement, because just outrightly saying you're convicted is going to lead to much worse problems than not. There's similar sentiments sometimes in rabbinic literature, and one of the things I do is look at a lot of Tannaitic literature, which is early rabbinic literature, and Tannaitic literature tends to be much sparser. It doesn't have really long stories. And so I try to look at these little hypothetical stories that they give, like, so, someone might say that this would happen, and then they tend to negate it. But sometimes the stories that they tell as these hypotheticals are way more powerful than the answers they give. So in this example, they are saying it's an instruction to the judge. You, the judge, should not fear man, lest you say, I am afraid of so-and-so, lest he kill my children, or lest he set fire to my stacks of grain, or lest he uproot my planting. Scripture says, do not be fearful of man, for judgment is God's. So knowing that scripture says that, you no longer have to worry that the defendant will kill your children, right? It's not a great answer. And I think, so my reading of this is that they do this deliberately. They have this very stark story and with a not great answer as a way of signaling, like, we know that this can be problematic. We know that it's not always the right thing to do to just say what the verdict is, no matter what. Just checking the time here. I may wind up skipping a few things because just to stay on target for time. But I do want to bring up a third category. It's probably my most my least or most controversial category, which is that sometimes the rule of law gets in the way of relational care, or like being caring to people you care about. And I've called that kind of relational neglect. So this is one example that seems like just kind of corruption or pure favoritism, but I try to read this in a charitable way to figure out what's going on here. So the story is very cryptic and it takes a lot of explanation, but I'll do my best. Rav Safra's father left him with money. He took it and entered into a business venture. His brothers summoned him for judgment before Rava. Rava said to them, Rav Safra is a great man. He does not abandon his studies and toil on behalf of others. And the end of that should be, so go away. What's going on here? Rav Safra, who is a member of the rabbinic discipleship community, right? He studies Torah all the time, or as much as he possibly can, inherited some money. So he went and invested it and is basically living off this investment. And so he can dedicate all of his time to Torah with Rava. These brothers come and are like, hey, that inheritance was ours too, and we deserve some of this money based on the investment. And instead of kind of telling them that they're right, and they are kind of right, or possibly right, Rava says, go away. You know, Rav Safra isn't doing this for you. Like, I know, like, this is keeping his Torah study going. So he intended to do that just for himself. And because of that, you don't really have a claim in it, so go away. This is really often seen by scholars as just favoritism, but I wanted to say that his impulse is not wrong, right? He cares about him and he's a member of his guild and his group, and he wants to make sure that he can survive, right, off of some kind of material sustenance so that he can dedicate his life to this spiritual pursuit. I don't think that that's a bad ethical impulse, but it obviously runs against, you know, doing the right thing according to the law. So what does the Talmud mean in telling us this story? Do they want us to judge him badly, or do they want us to be sympathetic? And I think it's really ambiguous. So this is the kind of story that makes you question, like, is the law the right thing here, or is Rav Safra great, and does he kind of deserve this, and he did the business venture? So I think that that's what that does. There's also a saying, which may seem really startling, from the Babylonian Talmud that kind of upholds this idea of relational care and how that even seeps into the courtroom. Rava said, may it come upon me that when a disciple of the sages came before me for judgment, I did not rest my head on my pillow until I had argued in favor of his merits. So he's just outright saying, if it's someone in my group that I know and that I care about and that I know is, devoting their life to Torah, I will figure out a way to make sure that I rule in favor of them. I won't stop until I figure that out. Oh, this screen just kind of disappeared. So I will look at that. Okay. So in the end, we saw those measuring images before that show this objective kind of image for what justice is. And I read a short story in the Babylonian Talmud as most people have read this story as kind of just a weird formalistic thing that kind of show how legalistic and formalistic the rabbis could be. But I like to read it, whether it was intended this way or not, as a much larger comment on judging. So it's a fun story. It starts like this. The wife of Rav Huna had a case before Rabbi Nachman. He said, how should I act? If I stand up before her, right, out of respect, because she's the wife of someone in the rabbinic community, the claims of the other litigant will be silenced. Like, obviously, the other litigant is like the judge is standing up and respecting the other person. If I don't stand up before her, a woman chaver, that means someone in the community, a close community person, a woman chaver, she's like a chaver. He said to his attendant, fly a duck at me and I will stand as one stands because of a duck. So this is his crazy plan, is that he needs to stand up before her, but he doesn't want the other litigant to feel bad. So he makes his attendant like find a duck and throw him into the courtroom so he can like get up and run away. And then he's done it. So it does seem like a very formalistic answer to that, and also a very ad hoc answer. Like, what is he doing? So just to first stop there for a second, I do want to say that this is still a problem. So he hasn't really solved the problem, because I would say that the problem is not that he has to figure out whether to stand up or sit down. The problem is that he has tremendous respect already pre-existing for one of the litigants, and the other one is just some guy. And that is surely going to influence the way he judges this case, as we just saw with Rava. But that's not the problem that he's trying to deal with. He's trying to deal with this more surfacey problem. So he's already like got his eye off the right thing he should be dealing with. But that's the story. And then the Gemara, the Talmudic anonymous layer, comes and proposes something a little more useful, because every time this happens, you can't just go find a duck. So they say he should sit as one who unties the laces of his shoes and say, so and so man, you are clear, and so you are liable. So he should sit, but he should also bow, right, the top part of his body, so that he's both showing respect and sitting at the same time, and so the litigant won't know what he's doing. And this is an image of a judge that's bent over, which I find really striking. I had AI try to generate an image for me. It was not easy. Oh, why isn't it working? Oh, there it is. Got it. So this is what I came up with. Sorry about the wig. I tried so many different, and he is actually untying his shoes. I tried to say as if he was tying his shoes, but it just made him tie his shoes. But this is an image, forget the shoe tying part. Like, the judge is really bent over. And I kind of associated this with that whole brouhaha that happened with Colin Kaepernick when he took the knee instead of standing for the anthem. Like, he was trying to show respect, so he wasn't just sitting down, but he was also trying to say that there's a problem that people aren't acknowledging. So he was also trying to, show that in some way. And to me, this is a very similar kind of posture. And what does it say to us if this is the image of the judge that the Talmud proposes that we should think about and that the judge should do if there's ever a case when a rabbinic litigant is there? And to me, this is a real acknowledgement that the judge is human and gets into binds and can't stand there as like a conduit straight from God to the law to himself and, speak forth, but that he is compromised and that we need to recognize that and not pretend that we don't know that or we don't see that. I'm going over time a little, so I'm gonna skip a few things that I had. Some of it is just about what other things can be done, but this talk isn't really about what we should do. It's really about the stories that we tell. So I'm going to skip what alternative practices are and just kind of say there are ways to do contextualized judgment where it's not just applying the law no matter what, but seeing who's there and what their needs are and how to respond to their needs. So I got a couple of stories about that. There's also mediation, compromise, where everybody just has to agree. And if everyone agrees, even if you don't get everything you want, at least you have a good outcome. But I did want to say that there are perhaps other stories that we can tell aside from, Solomon and his perfect judgment, who almost cuts a baby in half in order to show that he embodies the truth. And this is just a fantastic story from the Palestinian Talmud that really is about judgment. So Alexander of Macedon, and Alexander the Great here is standing in for the Emperor of Rome because they're living under Rome. So this is really about Roman stuff. So Alexander of Macedon went to King Katya, the king at the end of the world. So this is a fantasy story. He showed him all this gold and silver, like to appease him. He said, no, I don't need your gold or silver. I only came to see your practices, how you engage in legal proceedings and how you judge. While he was occupied with him, an individual came to bring a legal suit against his fellow, who had bought a dilapidated building, dug into it, and found a treasure of dinars. The buyer said, I bought a dilapidated building, but I didn't buy a treasure. The seller said, a dilapidated building and all that was in it is what I sold. So they're trying to say that give the other person the treasure. The seller, while they were occupied with each other, the king said to one of them, do you have a son? He answered, yes. He said to his fellow, do you have a daughter? He answered, yes. He told them, wed this son with this daughter, and the treasure will be for both of them. Alexander started to laugh. The king asked, why are you laughing? Did I not judge well? The king then asked, if this case were brought to your court, how would you rule? Again, so thinking of Rome and the Roman Empire, Alexander told him, we would kill this one and that one, and the treasure would be brought to the king. So I think that what this story is doing is showing two opposite ends of a continuum, right? And the arbitrary violence and self-enrichment that Rome is doing is at the end of very, very bad. But what I think is interesting is what's on the other end. And it's not perfect rule of law, actually, right? It's a perfect and utopian example of compromise and generosity. So I think that what this story does is construct a different cultural narrative that we could tell. Not that the law is what comes to save us, but that our choice to be generous and to share with others could be a cultural choice we make, and that is what will save us. Thank you.